you all know that Earth's resources and the geohazard conveys the message that areas of the Earth's resource exploration and geohazard are very important for the sustenance of our life and the progress of economy. With this few words, I welcome all of you in today's deliberation and discussion on the different topics, lectures on earthquake, tsunami, and groundwater. I am also very pleased to note that with our scientists going to have a very lively discussion today on the important topic that topical. So with this, I really find this program a very well planned to connect the budding scientist, the common man, which are the stakeholders of the science. And I am sure that all of you will be benefited with this. So I welcome once again to all of you in this and request my colleague, Dr. Punchandra, to start the proceeding.
Very good afternoon to all the young school children, college students who have shown a lot of enthusiasm to come for this CSR NGRI Virtual Open Day. I'm very glad to share with you that NGRI has successfully completed or has entered the 60th year of its existence, and as a part of this Diamond Jubilee celebrations, we have arranged this virtual open day. So normally we have an open day where all the children are invited to come and see the laboratories of CSR and GRI, to interact personally, physically with all the scientists. So unfortunately, due to the COVID pandemic, we are having the program virtual. I do hope that next year, when we conclude the Diamond Jubilee celebration, I really hope that we'll be able to invite all of you to come and see the institute and to discuss with our scientists on topics related to earth sciences. So with these few words, I would like to hand over to Dr. Vineet Gehlot who is going to moderate today's session. So as you can see, we have these 3 topics coming up, and questions from you are most welcome. I would request you to text your questions, and as far as possible, we'll be able to take up these questions and answer. We also have a panel of scientists here who shall look into these questions. So, over to Dr. Vineet.
Thank you. I think without any delay, we'll start this. And what we have arranged is that first we'll have these 3 lectures. These are kind of popular lecture which will give you flavor what NJRI is doing, what is the research going on elsewhere. So, and these are very topical issues: earthquake, tsunami, and groundwater. And then at the end of it, we will have a question answer session. So I request everybody who are watching this live, please give your please put your questions there, and we'll try to take up, depending upon time, we'll try to take up as many as possible. We have a panel of scientists here. They're all senior scientists, and we'll try to answer them. These questions could be related to not. We're not saying that. You can ask questions only on these topics, but whatever you must have seen this film, so you can send a question which is related to earth sciences, in which NJRI is involved. So with this, I think I'll request all of you to send those questions, and we'll start these lectures soon. But before that, there is there's an item in which we want to felicitate. We want to reward some of our colleagues. So it will not take much time, just 5 minutes, if you allow us, and then we'll start with these 3 seminars, these 3 presentations.
Hello. The NJRI Diamond Jubilee logo, we had announced a competition, and the first prize, the prize winning entries goes to Mrs. Jaspreet, daughter of Sri Diljit Singh. So may I request Mrs. Jaspreet to please come onto the dais. Please give her a big hand.
And that's the logo she has designed.
We also have a few prizes for essay writing competition. Raj Nandini Kashyap from IICT. Please clap loudly. Divya Roshni, she's also she's Inspire SRF from IICT. Congratulations. Next we have Divya Roshni. She is a CSAR SRF from IICT. Claps में कंजूसी नहीं करना. And then we have Snehal Ashok Rao Hole, Inspire JRF from IICT. Okay. Next, Aarti Devi, Project Assistant, NJRI. Please come. Then Paramita Das, ICMR SRF from IICT. And then we have Bouquet Vani, CSR SRF from IICT. Please come. Sorry. Please come. Bukke Vani from IICT. Then we have Aditya Undru. Aditya Undru from CCMB. And finally, yeah, please come. This is Aditya Undru. And finally, we have Avilash Kumar Paswan, Inspire SRF from NGRI. Please come. So with that, we come to the end of the prize distribution ceremony. So we have. Okay, thank you very much. He has offered to contribute this amount for a noble cause. Thank you very much. All right, with that we come to the end. We thank Dr. V.M. Tiwari, our director, for very kindly giving away the prizes, and hearty congratulations to all the prize winners. Please give a big round of applause. Yeah. So now we get back to today's presentations and interaction program. Okay.
Thank you very much, and congratulations to everybody who received this award. So these are three popular lectures, and they're all senior scientists of NGRI. So the first presentation is by Dr. Sri Nagesh. He's the chief scientist here. He's expert in earth science, and he's one of the authority in his art. So first lecture by Dr. Sri Nagesh, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon. What is the Earth facts? We all think it's 24 hours a day. We all think 365 days Earth is orbital period per year. But I just tell this because it's rather very important. There's a tilt of the axis of the Earth. The Earth is not rotating on the straight axis. It has got a tilt. The diameter is about 12,756 kilometers. The mean density, if there was no density distribution variation or temperature variation, Earth would have been a dead planet. But the mean density is 5.515. The mean surface temperature is 15 degrees. The atmospheric composition, as you see, is 77% is of nitrogen and 21% is oxygen. And you will know when this oxygen really started coming into the atmosphere. The crustal rocks, they have different kinds of different chemical composition and mineralogy. The most important thing for sustainability on planet Earth for mankind is the magnetic field. This is rather very important for us to remember, and you'll see how the magnetic field is created. Plate tectonics, that's very important. And the hydrosphere and the biosphere. See, because of the plate tectonics today, the consequences of plate tectonics, we are talking about two aspects. The earthquakes and an associated hazard, which is called the tsunami. The third thing which very carefully was planned is the hydrosphere, which is about water and the biosphere. And today morning, as the principal scientific advisor was saying, it's rather very important for all of us to look into the climate change aspects on the decadal scales, not on the geological scales. As I was talking in the previous slide, there are three aspects of the Earth which is rather very important. They are called the Milankovitch cycles. The eccentricity, that means the orbit, which is elliptical in nature, has got its own eccentricity. Ellipse has got an eccentricity to be estimated. And it changes from 100,000 years to 430,000 years. So the orbital eccentricity changes. Very important is the precision. The precision with which it is. Like, I hope youngsters play with tops, and you'll see that the top, after some time, when it is losing its centrifugal force, there's a precision coming in. And similarly, there's a precision which comes in and which changes every 20,000 years. And there's also the tilt, which I talked. And as of now, the tilt is about 23.45. The tilt has also got a variation in 41,000 years, anywhere from 21.5 to 24.5. All these play a very vital role in a bearing on the planet Earth. And Milankovitch was a scientist who tried to propose this particular thing. It's rather very important to know this. Today, as the age of the rocks was being spoken, the oldest earth minerals, which are the zircons, they're supposed to be 4.2 billion years. Zircons are American diamonds, in this which are crystallized and formed. They're known that they retain their identity and the age can be found out. The oldest moon rocks happen to be 4.4 billion years old, and the estimated age of the Earth is 4.55. That's very old. When you look at the early Earth timeline, which is rather very important to look at, the Earth formed at 4.5 billion years ago. The oxidation event, the life form started coming in, atmosphere started coming about 3.5. And then we had about 2.4 billion years ago, the great oxidation event happening. And then host of things happened all around the time. And rather very important to be noted here is that every time there was a punctuation in the Earth's history, and that made a very, very significant role. And if there was no water, there was no life, unicellular organism, the photosynthesis reaction wouldn't have happened, and then the oxygen wouldn't have come in. So every time there was a punctuation in the Earth's history, it made very important for the sustainability of mankind. To see how earthquakes really occur, we first need to learn about the constitution of the Earth, because that is from where internally there is a driving engine which drives the superficial material, where the energy comes from the core. Very importantly, we have to realize is that there are three major layers: the crust, the mantle, the core. And the crust and the mantle, the crust is about anywhere from 10 kilometers to 70 kilometers, 10 kilometers beneath the oceans, 70 kilometers beneath the mountains. And the mantle is approximately, if you take an average crust of 35, goes up to 2,900 kilometers. Again, the mantle is stratified based on its rigidity, viscosity, and other aspects. The two aspects of core need to be looked into. One is the outer core and the other is the inner core. The outer core is liquid and the inner core is very solid. And because of the differential movement of the outer core and the inner core through the dynamo theory, magnetic field is created. One important aspect which we have to know, nobody drilled a hole right to the center of the Earth, which happens to be 6,371 kilometers, but it is the seismic waves which were recorded since 1892 were responsible in trying to unravel the internal structure of the Earth. That's very, very important to know. So earthquakes do create destruction because of the faulty construction we do, but certainly it has given all the knowledge of what is inside the Earth. And that is based on the observational seismology we do. What are these forces which are responsible, which are acting inside, is called the tectonic forces. The interior of the Earth is dynamic. It cools down, and that provides energy for convective currents in the outer core and in the asthenosphere. So the crust and the mantle combined together can be divided into two, called the lithosphere and the asthenosphere. The convective currents in the outer core as well as in the asthenosphere, which makes the interior of the Earth to be dynamic in nature. And the additional energy for driving this comes from the radioactive decay. So the composition of the Earth which you have inside has got these radioactive elements which are decaying and generating heat energy. So convection, as all of us learn through processes of heat transfer in our 7th, 8th, 9th classes, either to conduction or convection. In conduction, it's only the heat is being transferred ionically, but in convection, heat is not only being transferred but also through mass. So there's a mass also involved in it, and convection in the atmosphere enables the tectonic processes, which is called the plate tectonics. And indeed, if you see the horizontal cross section which you see here, is basically the interior of the earth, that wherever you have the cold material going down, which is more dense, goes down, sinks, subducts, gets melted. Once it melts, the density decreases and the material starts coming down. So this is the fundamental principle in which the plate tectonics operates in the earth. Plate tectonic theory is very young, 60s, the late 60s it came in. It provides answers to the most fundamental questions in seismology. Why earthquakes occur? Why are the earthquake epicenters not uniformly distributed around the globe? And what depths are the foci? And the question is, where do these earthquakes occur and how often also is a very important question for all of us. 80% of all earthquakes occur in the circum-Pacific belt. Most of these result from the convergent plate margin, boundary. 15% occur in the Mediterranean Asiatic belt. Remaining 5% of the earthquakes occur in the interiors of the plate and on spreading ridge centers, where material is being brought up. More than 150,000 earthquakes strong enough to be felt are recorded each year. So that means Earth is very active seismically. Just a cartoon to show from 1900 to 2017 how the earthquake foci are distributed, and the larger the size of the diameter of the dot means larger the magnitude is. So we have seen in this present millennium, 2 earthquakes exceeding magnitude 9, both of them generating tsunami and a number of people dying. So we saw that these are happening, the earthquakes are located along the plate boundaries. So we have about 16 major plates. These are rigid surface plates which are about 100 to 150 kilometers thick beneath the continents and about a few tens of kilometers thick beneath the oceans. Okay. This acts as a lid on the surface of the earth where the atmospheric temperature happens to be 20 degrees. By the time you go down to the base of the lithosphere, it's almost 1400 degrees centigrade. So this is like an insulating material that is being driven. So this is a picture where we live on one of the plates, which is called the Indian plate, which traversed for thousands of kilometers. In the initial stages, it was traveling at a speed of more than 15 to 20 centimeters per year. But presently, during the last 55 million years after collision, the velocity at which the plate is moving has decreased and is moving at a rate of 5 centimeters per year in the north-northeast direction. And this is how the aftermath of the Indian plate colliding with the Eurasian plate in the north resulted in the Himalaya and mountain heights going as high as 8 kilometers. So when 2 fast-moving objects are moving in the opposite direction, collide, so consequences is compression and material being lifted. Interacting plates. So they've got 3 plate boundaries. One, where material is going down beneath the other plate, that is the rigid plate. Those are called the subduction zones, these ones, or the collision zones. There are places where the material is being brought up at the ocean centers, called the ridges. And then we have plate boundaries along the continents which rub past against each other, which are called the transform faults, and the example happens to be the San Andreas. In the case of India, the ridges, there are many ridges in the Indian Ocean, and the subduction and the collision zone in the north, that is the Himalayan collision zone, and in the east, especially in the southeast, in the Andaman Nicobar, we have the oceanic subduction zone where the plate is going down. Now, how earthquakes occur? Earthquakes occur at faults. Fault is a weak zone separating two geological blocks. Tectonic forces cause the blocks to move relatively one to another. It's not that simple, but it's trying to give you an illustrative example how these earthquakes, when the faults or the blocks move, that the earth strain energy is released. Take, for example, a foam comprising of 3 layers with different densities, and you subject it to either extension, compression, or shearing. You get, in the case of extension, you do find faults which are regional in nature, and you see one of them going relatively to one another, either being raised up or going down. In the compressional faults, like in the Himalayan collision zone, you find the material is being compressed, and the rocks which are deformed are slowly being thrusted up against each other. In the case of the shearing, take a piece of paper and you tear apart. The shearing happens along the weak plane. Similarly, it does happen in the case like what we saw in San Andreas. So the examples are for normal, basin and range in African rift. In our case, it could be Godavari rift or Narmada zone. In the reverse faulting, it's the Himalaya, and where you find mostly these thrust type earthquakes. And strike slip, you do have San Andreas. We do have such strike slip earthquakes happening well within the plated areas. And these little things are cartoon, not cartoon, but real photographs to depict how one block has risen above the other very clearly. And this is the San Andreas fault, which you can see the lateral. How do earthquakes occur? In 1905, after the San Francisco earthquake happened, this is the envelope of the San Andreas fault, and a 3-meter displacement along the fence was observed. And then they started explaining why and how it happened. What does the elastic rebound theory stick upon? 3 F's of earthquakes: the forces, the faults, and the friction. So the forces could be acting opposite to each other, or in a 3-dimension, you can resolve these forces into three dimensions and look at how the dominant forces are acting and how this material how these blocks can be deformed and they can move in different directions. But these 3 F's are very, very important and they are necessary conditions for earthquakes to happen. When the earthquakes happen, you have the elastic bound theory, which I said so, is based on the Hooke's law. That is, take a rubber band and stretch and release after stretching the force. You see that the rubber band is coming back to its original state. Provided the length before the stretching and after the stretching remains the same, then whatever the stresses you applied or forces you applied, and once you remove, it has come back to its original state. We call this as a linear state. But really it doesn't happen. You'll find certain deformation being retained because of the inhomogeneity within the earth. When the earthquake happens, the elastic waves are generated. There are 2 types of waves: the body waves. They are faster, and the longitudinal waves. These are the first to arrive on a seismogram, which are analogous to the sound waves, and the transversal waves. These are the ones which are analogous to the light waves, that is, the particle motion and the propagation direction of the wave are perpendicular to each other. They could be within the same plane or perpendicular to the plane of propagation. So this is how the P waves look like: compressions and rarefactions of the elastic material, where the particles are either being compressed or rarefied, and the energy is being transmitted. In the shear waves, either perpendicular to the direction of propagation or within the plane of propagation. These are called the transverse waves. And these are the waves which are responsible for ground shear. In addition to these 2, we do also have the surface waves. Incidentally, the surface waves mathematical formulation was given 100 years before these waves were identified. And these are called the Rayleigh and the Love waves. The difference between the body waves and the Rayleigh surface waves. Surface waves are dispersed in character, that is, larger the amplitudes means they travel, larger the frequency, that is, larger the time periods, they sample the Earth. Deeper, lesser the frequency or lesser the time periods, they are sampling the shallow part of the Earth. And this is very, very important, and these are the ones which helped us to know the velocity structure of the Earth because of the dispersive pattern. So how do they look like? There's a recent earthquake happened in Tibet. So the primary waves are this, the shear waves are this, and followed by the surface waves. So this is, we have three components in a seismogram, and this is what is recorded as displacement with respect to time. These are the amplitudes of displacement, and this is the time axis, which means we record the velocity. We record them in three components because each of these components record these P, S, and surface waves very well. Seismographs are the ones which we use, and these are the devices that record ground motion during earthquakes. The first seismograms were constructed at the very end of the 19th century in Italy and Germany, and the 1890 and the 1892 seismograph recorded, one at Potsdam and other in Germany, are plotted. This is the Japanese earthquake, and this is from Afghanistan, not Pakistan. When earthquakes happen, a lot of destruction takes place, and that's all because of the energy which is released in the terms of strain energy, and we record them as seismic waves, and that is called the magnitude. The quantitative measure of strength of an earthquake, which now we use in the modern seismology, is moment magnitude, and this is proportional to the logarithm of the area of the fault and seismic energy released during the rupture. It can be measured directly from the seismograms, and this shows you the number of earthquakes which happen every year. As we go higher on the scale, the frequency of the earthquakes happening decreases. One important point to be noted: every time you jump from magnitude 2 to magnitude 3, the energy is 32 times more. So that means every jump on a scale of 1 magnitude frequency means 32 times more. That is from 2 to 4, it is 32 into 32. So you can imagine as you are climbing up the scale that the energy which is released is going to be tremendously. So I end this talk. Earthquakes don't kill people, but buildings which you design, and earthquake-resistant buildings are rather very important. We think that earthquakes cause damage. Certainly they do cause damage. In this figure, if you can see, everything was not razed to the ground. Scientifically, if you look at it, there could be reasons. The frequency at which the ground shake or the construction practices followed. This is a photograph from Istanbul in Turkey. So with these few words, I would like to stop my talk. Thank you very much for giving me.
Thank you. We'll take up the question at the end after finishing all the talks. So the next talk is by Dr. Kirti Srivastava. She's expert in tsunami modeling, and I think she's going to speak on tsunami and how do they get generated, and how do you model them, how do you and tsunami hazard is like.
Already Dr. Sri Nagesh has told you all about earthquakes. So when you have earthquake under sea, then you get tsunamis. But not every earthquake will generate a tsunami. So I'm waiting for my PPT to come up. So what is a tsunami? It is nothing but ocean waves that are generated due to different causes. And once the tsunami is generated, It will propagate in all directions and it will cause a lot of damage. So Dr. Sri Nagesh has already showed you the areas in subduction zones where you have a lot of earthquakes going on. So how those earthquakes will generate a tsunami and how you try to model these tsunamis. So without seismologists, tsunami modeling cannot be done. And without mathematics, you cannot do modeling. So how these two are integrated, I'll try to show you all. We in India are quite safe from tsunamis. Reason, we are far from the subducting zone. See, we have only two sources. One is the Makran subduction zone and the other is Andaman Sumatra subduction zone. Sorry. You have only two subduction zones. One is the Makran subduction zone here and the other is Sumatra subduction zone. So only when you have an earthquake in these regions, you'll get a tsunami. But not every earthquake. Okay? It should be a thrust earthquake, and I'll tell you all why. And the magnitude of the earthquake is also very important. So now, what is a tsunami? Tsunami is nothing but it's called harbor wave in a Japanese word or seismic sea waves. You can call. So this is how a tsunami wave would look like. Now, causes of tsunami. It can be due to an undersea earthquake, because wherever you have subduction zones going on, there you can have an earthquake. Only a thrust earthquake will give rise to a tsunami, and only in subducting zones you will have tsunami. I'll also show you, if you have an earthquake in the ocean, does not mean it will give you a tsunami. Why? I'll just show you all that. And undersea landslides. Suppose you have a lot of material like this coming and just falling here. You know, the mass with which it falls and will create the upliftment of the water column, and that would propagate as a wave, tsunami wave. Then submarine volcanoes also would give rise to an uplift in the water column and would travel, and that would give rise to a tsunami. Similarly, a meteorite impact will also give rise to a tsunami. Now, what are the stages of tsunami? Is generation, that happens due to an earthquake or due to any of those causes, then the wave propagation, and then you come to inundation. Now, coming to generation, what happens when you have an earthquake at the sea bottom? You have an earthquake. Something has, the release of energy has taken place. So all the seismic parameters like the focal depth, the strike angle, the dip angle, all those parameters, the seismologists quantify them, and then you try to understand what is the deformation. So what happens in an earthquake? If it is a thrust earthquake, there is a compression and there is a dilatation. In compression, what happens? The material would go up. If some material just goes up, then what will happen? The water column will also get risen. That water column has to propagate. And how would it propagate? You need to form the wave equations. How would the wave equations be generated? The water particle has to move. If the water particle has to move, you start from what is called the pressure behind the particle should be greater than the pressure in front. Then it will move. So you start with force is equal to mass into acceleration. And then using conservation laws, and then using all the other assumptions, you come to wave equations. You solve those equations. Once you solve it, you know what would be the run-up at the coast, and you know what is the amount of inundation that has taken place. So these are the stages of tsunami. Now, in the deep oceans, at a depth of say 7 kilometers, the velocity is something around 900 kilometers per second, and the wavelength about 200 or 400 kilometers. So this is a kind of velocities that you have in the deep oceans, and And as I said, mentioned to you all, every earthquake need not generate a tsunami. It is only earthquakes of magnitude greater than 6.5 will give rise to a tsunami. If you have something between 6.5 to say 7.5, it generally gives you a local tsunami. And for 9 magnitude or 8.5, the waves would travel to long distances. Since India is far from these two subducting zones, we are quite safe. So this kind of a slide was shown by Dr. Sri Nagesh already. And some of the major earthquakes, as I told you, in 1945, 8.1 magnitude earthquake in the Makran subduction zone had created a tsunami. And those days, there was a person by name Pense in Survey of India who measured, how did he measure the tsunami height at that time? It was only a bucket hanging on a treetop. So he said in Mumbai, the tsunami height was about 2 meters. And when you do modeling, with those parameters, you get approximately the same. But by 2004, we had more idea about tsunami generation, propagation, and inundation, and people started modeling. Even in 2004, we were quite ignorant about several things. So that was one tsunami which was well recorded and documented. After that, of course, we had the 2011 Tohoku tsunami. And just to get a glimpse about the kind of damage these tsunamis cause, look at this. And these are all the damages caused, and I'm sure these are the slides given to me long back by Vinny. Some of them, they had gone there at that time after the tsunami, and you just see these. This is how the after earthquake has shown. And see here, look at this region, the aerial view in the Andaman region there. See, all the trees have got washed away. Look at all this mud. The Nandi is still sitting intact. And this is Bande Aceh. And before the tsunami and after the tsunami. You look at the kind of damage. And this is the Tohoku tsunami. Look how the tsunami wave has come, and before and after. So these are a few kinds of examples which I would like to show you all. And now, as I mentioned to you, we all know something has been generated in the ocean bottom, and it's moving. How is it moving? As I mentioned, the pressure behind the particle and the pressure in front, what should be there? And how you generate these equations. These are the kind of equations. Okay, this is a generation process. So you try to start writing up the equation. And once you have the nonlinear equations, you need to have what is called boundary conditions. So what would be your boundary? And where would you stop? And so generation is based on your mechanical characteristics, that is strike, tip, slip, and fault plane. From all this, you try to compute the strain field. Once you know the strain field, if you were to plot for a thrust earthquake, you'll only get two lobes, that is compression or dilatation. Compression material is going up and dilatation is coming down. So once you push up the water column, it will form into a wave. Whereas if you have a strike slip, say you have four lobes. You have compression, dilatation, again compression and dilatation. So when you have a wave, you cannot generate, in the case if you have the sea bottom going as a strike slip earthquake. And these are the kind of equations which you will get after you solve those equations. So then you have to put boundary conditions. You say India, say you have an example of India. Now you have in the Makran subduction zone. What would you be your boundary? The west coast of India will be one boundary. The other end, the Oman region will be one boundary. And the open sea is another boundary condition. So using these kind of boundary conditions and your domain, you will try to solve these equations. And once you solve, you look at this animation. Look, you are getting a tsunami from the Makran side. You are getting a tsunami from the Andaman Sumatra subduction zone. Look at the Makran tsunami. Is it going to Mumbai first or it's just going down? It's not reaching Mumbai. Before it can even reach Mumbai, it is going to go up. What would your logic and my logic say? It will say, no, if the tsunami is coming from Makran, it's going to reach first Mumbai. That's my logic. But no, that's not happening because you have a wide shelf in this region. And it will take a few hours for it to come from Makran to your coast. Similarly, for the Andaman Sumatra subduction zone, it will take some time, few hours, say 3 hours or so, to reach your east coast. So we are safe in several terms from the tsunamis. And this is how you have your major earthquakes in this Andaman Sumatra subduction zone. And you can just see this. These are all the thrust earthquakes. And these are strike slip earthquakes. The ones with 4 lobes are your strike slip, and the one with 2 lobes, which I have mentioned, is your thrust earthquake. So only a thrust will give you a tsunami. So the moment you know you have some earthquakes in this region, you're not going to get any tsunami. This was first told to me by Dr. Purnachandra Rao, who is here. So this is one thing which we ourselves have seen it. And you see, these are the few major earthquakes which have given rise to tsunamis in the Andaman Sumatra subduction zone. And you had the 2004 Sumatra earthquake. After that, it was followed by another earthquake, which was a Nias earthquake. That gave rise to a local tsunami. And then you had the 12th September 2007 Bengkulu earthquake, which I shall talk about later. So this is the 2004 Sumatra earthquake. I'm trying to show you this. This is called the directivity map. Don't you think this directivity map looks like your fingers? This, in Japanese, they call it fingers of God. I don't know why they kept that name, but because the directivity, which shows you the maximum wave height, which is moving, so it is more towards the open ocean, and this is how it is. And now coming to Makran subduction zone. In Makran subduction zone, which is to the west of India, you have, in this region, most of the earthquakes have taken place to the eastern side. And there's nothing going on the western side. And I'll show you in the next figure. And this is a Murray Ridge system. So somebody can have an earthquake here. An earthquake comes somewhere here. And which is not your thrust earthquake. People have generated tsunamis from that. But it is not possible to generate a tsunami from a ridge system. We will show you examples of that later. And here you see the fingers of God getting directed towards the Indian coast. Because this Murray Ridge system is existing there, it is getting shifted towards the Indian coast. But you can't have large earthquakes in this region. The reason being, the subduction zone there is not very wide. Here, you look, towards the eastern side of the Makran subduction zone, you had few major earthquakes, whereas the western part was not having any earthquake. They can call this region as locked, and this as an active subduction zone. In 1945, we had the last earthquake there. So if I were to generate the 2009 earthquake in the Andaman region as a thrust earthquake, what difference it makes? I'm a mathematician. I can make it a thrust earthquake. I can generate and give you a directive P map. No, it is only a seismologist who will tell me whether it's a thrust earthquake, strike slip, or what. Then I go ahead with my mathematical modeling. Now you have what is called the DART system, which will record your tsunami, whether it'll tell you the pressure difference and then it'll give you the signal and then it comes to the base station. In Hyderabad, we have a center like this. That is in Kois in Hyderabad. They have now deployed several buoys around and they are detecting the tsunamis. So, yes, there is a tsunami. Is it on land or on sea? If it is on sea, yes, we are going to get a tsunami. I will generate or I'll pick up some from the database and give you what is the wave heights and what kind of inundation you will have. And if not, then I go with the other theory. So what we did in India, right? I'll tell you. We, on 12th September 2007, there was a tsunami. Suddenly there was an earthquake in the Bengkulu region. So we were asked to generate the tsunami and see how close we were. What we did was, looking into the information from the past earthquakes in that region, we picked up the strike angle, the dip angle, the other parameters, and the magnitude of the earthquake was given to us by Dr. Sri Nagesh, and we did the modeling, and we were quite close to the prediction. Because we could say within an hour, yes, tsunami is generated, but the tsunami is not coming to the Indian coast. Even if it comes, it will be very, very small. So we were quite close to our, close to predicting that, yes, tsunami will be generated, but it will not be a destructive tsunami. And you see, the date from the information from the data buoy has taken more than 2 to 3 hours. So a modeling will definitely give you precise information if you know the right parameters that are going. The right strike angle, the dip angle, the focal depth, all the important parameters are very important because they will give you the deformation in that particular region, the strain fields you will get. So thank you for your patience. And as I said, at the end of the talk, all the talks we will answer. Thank you one and all.
Thank you, Dr. Kirti. So after earthquake and hazard, we have a topic, we have chosen a topic which is on groundwater. Where is Suvash? Yes, Suvash, yes. So he will talk about the techniques used in exploration of groundwater, the future, and what NGRA is doing in groundwater exploration. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm going to present on groundwater, and I will start from very the initial stage, that how the groundwater explosion started, where so groundwater is very dear to all of us. We can't imagine the life without water, so this is the subject of to the common man. So I, so water is, water is alive. The saying is known to everyone. More than 70% of our body are contained by the water, and starting with the fetus, almost 100% to the old state it goes to 50%. So water is the most important, and then second primary need of after the oxygen to the body. And since more than 70%, our body contains water, so in fact it plays more role than the food, which is much smaller in amount, and therefore a good quality of water and adequate amount of water is needed to be ensured for our healthy life. The groundwater is highly unevenly distributed, and in different rock types, the groundwater occurrences are different. And the way of exploration also differs. So, and the groundwater bearing zones is called aquifer. So in alluvial, there may be different layering, multiple layering. Some layer may have a water, some layer may not. For example, sand has a good porosity as well as a good permeability. So it stores the water and it can transmit the water, whereas the clay do not. Clay has a high porosity but very poor permeability. So in hard rock, there are secondary porosity where these are water veins are in terms of cracks and fracture. And these water veins decide how much amount of water, and these also interact with the rock type. So the residence period also become very important in ascertaining the quality of the water. So all these factors controls the quantity as well as the quality of the water. The question, there could be many questions. If so unevenly distributed, then how to explore the water and how to assure that it is a good quality of water? And for example, if you drill a hand pump and if it intersects these water veins, then your hand pump may get the water. And if you miss it, you may not get it. And this could be the case of the hard rock where the water veins controls the groundwater occurrences. So the groundwater is not like a Mother Earth, that has an infinite amount of water. Rather, it has a limited amount of water, and we need to manage this judiciously. And to do so, we need to have a precise knowledge of the groundwater system. And there, the role of the science comes. Since the 5,000 years before the present, there have been more belief-based groundwater exploration, which is called esoteric, and then later it evolved where the geomorphology structure or geological geomorphological controls has been taken as a guiding tool to find out which locations has the more groundwater bearing or which location do not have. And then slowly the remote sensing has taken the place, and the efficacy keep on increasing with the time, and then later the geophysics has taken over. So which has a much higher accuracy than above all, and this is the path of evolution of the science. In the Vastu, it is not only in India, it is globally true, and people have been using this kind of technology where the directions decides the position of the water. So, for example, northeast is considered to be the location of the water, even the fire, and so many such things are there where your plot if has. So, northeast is your preferred location. There has been Vastu Guru or water gurus, the water diviner, the dowsing method has further come up where they will be taking different, like a pendulum kind of structure, a stick, even the coconut, and trying to locate the ground to bearing zone. However, as a fact checking, in 1990s in Germany, 30 experts different parts of the world have been invited to explore and to validate this method, how scientific or how valid it is. And to the surprise, all of them failed to detect a buried water, flowing water, underground water carrying the pipe. Uh, and these, whatever method initially were used, in fact, their success was depending because the earlier the water level was quite shallow, and the water level was quite at the shallow, where the alluvium, or the highly weathered zone at the shallow level has more homogeneous, more lateral connectivity, and hence chances of exploiting such water was quite high. So whatever method you use it, success rate was quite high. However, with the time, the moment and the way we start exploiting and the exploitation increases the groundwater recharge, the water level started declining, and then such method started failing, and it was no more valid, and then people started looking more scientific investigation which have more certainty in terms of exploring or locating the groundwater bearing zone, including their sustainability. So there are many methods. I'll be focusing here on the groundwater geophysics, where the physical principle has been applied to characterize the physical properties of the subsurface from the ground or surface. And then the Helibon geophysics has taken over, that makes almost 1,000 times faster in acquiring the data and makes a good coverage, because water is not a subject of a point, but it is contained in a certain container. So it has to be dealt in a hydrological unit or watershed scale. And the satellite geophysics has made it much faster. So, in a day you can in fact cover the large portion. So a regional level assessment can be done very quickly, even which cannot be done by Helibon. But then they have a different degree of resolution, scaling, etc. So these all methods are equally good, depend upon the scaling and then a kind of resolution is required. The resistivity profiling has been very popular since long back, and where you send the current into the ground and try to see that how resistance is measured. Higher the resistance, it is interpreted in hard rock case. It is higher the resistance, more rocky kind of terrain, and more hard and compact. Whereas if it is a lower the resistance or resistivity, then it is more weathered or weaker zone. And weaker the zone means there is a chances of getting the occurrences of the water. So, whereas in case of alluvial, higher the resistivity means more sandy, so that become a aquifer zone. So, depending upon the rock type, these method has been used, and this is a case of hard rock, where you take full set of electrode and do the profiling, and then try to see wherever the low resistivity, you can expect that these are the low resistivity zone. And it can be repeated at different electrode spacing to go lower and lower. Another method was sounding, which has been very popular and preferred over the profiling, because here only two electrodes, the outer electrode, current electrode are moved, and your center of investigation goes deeper and deeper. And And then, based on again restricted distribution, you try to locate such water-bearing zone, depending upon the rock type. And further, this methodology has been evolved during the 90s, where the profiling and sounding have been combined together. So you get the 2D, even the 3D from the 3D raised to T distribution. And this is indirectly interpreted the structure which holds the groundwater. This is again case from the hard rock terrain, and that is the resistivity, and here it is the chargeability. So using the electrical method, not only you get the resistivity, but you get the chargeability, you get the cell potential, and all these indicate a different properties, different parameter which can be used to interpret how the occurrences of the groundwater can be there. Cell potential, in fact, gives the movement. So the movement of any groundwater can create a kind of cell potential which can be measured. So that become a kind of direct indicative. A number of parallel profile of this 2D can construct the 3D, quasi 3D, or even it can be acquire the 3D data itself directly. That increases the reliability. So the Haley-Bohm geophysics, for example, by the VES or this ground-based measurement, we take 2, 3, or maximum 5 set of measurements depending upon the spread in a day. Whereas by Haley-Bohm geophysics, we can acquire 200 to 300 line kilometers in a day, the best conditions. So it becomes 2,000 or even more, faster coverage. And CSIR NJRA has been carrying out this Haley-Bohm geophysics for mineral exploration since long back. However, we entered in the groundwater, we used it for the groundwater exploration in the year 2012 onward. Initially, we took the 6 pilot area and then added two more. Now we are going to cover the almost northwest portion, starting from Haryana to up to the run of the Kutch, taking half of the Rajasthan. So, a kind of western portion we are going to cover it, where our civilization started. So, it's going to be very, very important in terms of understanding the underground processes, how it's taken place. And here we investigate the subsurface by sending the current into the loop, which is hanging below the helicopter. And helicopter is normally it flies at the speed of 60 to 100 kilometers per hour. So while at the moving platform, we acquire the data, and it all happens in the microsecond, something like that. So hardly a 3-meter movement we make it, and by the time our investigation is done, and we get a deeper information, 1D, and that is further process in terms of getting the 3D. One of this example is from the alluvial terrain near Patna, where the top is the Ganga river flowing towards the Patna, and then Soon is joining. And at the interflow region, this survey was done where the blue lines are showing the flight line, and this 3D block is showing the subsurface resistivity mass derived from the airborne survey. And this Soon river has been considered that the Soon course has been migrating towards. The river has been shifting toward the west. So that means the earlier it was flowing in towards the east portion, and it moved fast. So the old course is called the Paleo channel, and the light blue color, what we see in this 3D model, is basically the Paleo channel of the Soon, which is in fact visible at the surface itself. And if you cut it, you can see that how this Paleo channel is connected with the first aquifer, and then first aquifer is connected to the third aquifer. And this area is highly contaminated by the arsenic. So if arsenic contamination comes into the contact of such zone, this can spread very rapidly, not only the first aquifer, but the second aquifer. And the second aquifer, which is a considerably thick and has a large extension, it can take to the damage, contaminate the aquifer system to the great extent. So that's how such knowledge is very important. Even this knowledge can be used very effectively for managed aquifer recharge. So if you construct a managed aquifer recharge structure over here, we can increase the groundwater reserve and we can increase the groundwater level in fact. So that can be used. So knowledge of aquifer system becomes very, very important. And since the Helibond has a facility to provide a dense data measurement, we take this and this becomes very useful in visualizing in a detail in order to establish the connectivity or disconnectivity or how the system is there. So we get a clear detail to have a better plan for any kind of geotechnical installation. The study at Allahabad has in fact discovered a paleo channel, and this is the Ganga and Yamuna is meeting at the Prayagraj, and it was believed that the third river Saraswati has been joining these two rivers, and then all the water from all three rivers goes together. So it is very, very popular. Once in 12 years there is a Mahakumbh. And with this idea that how the paleo, and since it is a confluence, then it is expected that a lot of such paleo channel may be interacting, and more than its mythological importance, how these systems are contaminating each other. Like Yamuna is highly contaminated, Yamuna may be least. So, and how the interconnectivity between these river system and the aquifer system is there. So this study was very, very important, and with that this was carried out, and surprisingly we found that there was no such river which is meeting at the confluence of Ganga and Yamuna at Prayagraj, but before, 25 kilometers before, there is another river which has almost equal dimension as of the Ganga river, and the kind of nearing Ganga has, even this the inferred or discovered paleo channel has. And we also found that the root zone of these paleo channel and Ganga has equal. So they are co-equal formation, perhaps could have been formed at the same time, and the roots of these two paleo channel and Ganga river also are connected to the first principal aquifer at places, not everywhere. And there are wherever the river meandering is there, and you can see that there must be some tectonic or such features must be displacing. So, and those displacement can be seen in the Ganga as well as the Spanish paleo channel. So there is a strong commonality between these features. So that's how it shows that they are of the contemporary kind of feature, and we are further extending it towards the west up to Kanpur in the second phase, and then depending upon the result, we'll be looking into further detail. The smart city, the Surat Smart City project also we have carried out this experiment, and in fact when we started conceptualizing, we told this may be very, very costly, and why you want to do it, and if you do some measurement either side of the river, because their interest was to construct the French well within the river bed. So river bed characterization was the main concern of the Surat municipality, and they wrote a couple of times. We have been trying to ignore it, in fact, how the geophase can be used for such thing. And then once we interacted, they readily agreed, okay, you can do the Helibond, but we want this kind of measurement. And in fact, it was their initiative. So, and we could locate, characterize the river bed, though it is in the urban environment, two sides and partly crosses over the city, and then river has a lot of high tension wire, and we cross all along, and we put three parallel lines all along the rivers. We flown and then connected the site by wherever the possibility was there, and we finally got this image. The red patches shows the high resistivity, which shows the sand content, and these sand contents are not everywhere. Equally, because there have been sand mining, and that can be seen very clearly. And we could see even from the top 2 meter, we could locate even the rocky structure. And the more important, the salinity coming from the west sea coast, it has gone up to the 25 kilometers. That also has come up very nicely. Even in fact, we have proposed another check dam that they are going to construct those the rocky terrain, so to rejuvenate the aquifer system. In fact, so, as in the initial slide, I have shown the water veins, which is basically for granitic kind of terrain. So another study, Halimon study, was carried out at Tumpur, which is a granitic terrain, and it is one of the, the water stage is 150%. So that means if you recharge is 100, you exploit 150. So 1.5 times higher exploitation is done than the recharge. And from these 3D, we could map fracture pathways. So these sensitive zone at the deeper level has been put together and tried to find out the pattern, and which goes to be constructing a kind of linear to curvilinear pattern, and what we calling as a hydrolith, which is nothing but a network of the fracture pathways filled with water, and that it is made constructed at 100-meter depth. And after this, in fact, they wanted to drill it, and where this video shows that the water is coming like a jet. So, it has been even validated after the drilling, and in fact publishing this paper. Coming to the satellite geophysics, where the two satellite position is kept a certain distance, and depending upon the density, attraction between these distance, that decide finally how the moisture percentage, how the change in the mass is there due to the time lapse measurement by these kind of satellite-based observation. And this is one of the first images from India side, which appeared in 2009. And now it is being very widely used further to get if any landslide is there. Because once we know that our observation, any temporal changes can be interpreted by coupling the remote sensing based data or by any other data set. So there are a lot of ongoing research to how to increase the efficacy or reliability or downscale the resolution. So this is the current topic of the research. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So in case, I have some questions which I have noted down from several platforms, but before that, I thought if somebody in the audience wants to ask some question. Yeah, please. Yeah, you need to, how do we do it with social distancing? Yeah. That's a fixed mic. Okay, I'll take mine.
On.
Hi. Yeah. This is for the first speaker. I don't remember his name.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah. So, yes, hello. This is a very basic doubt, I guess, because as far as every time I was growing up, I really thought that the inner core was liquid and that the outer core was a little more towards the solid side. But you said that the inner core is solid, and I don't doubt you, of course. But how is it? It is true that as we go deeper towards the center of the Earth, the temperature increases, right? So how did the core become solid while the thing surrounding it is liquid?
There are two aspects, not only the temperature increasing, but also the pressure is increasing, and also the composition of what you have. So those all put together makes the difference between the outer core and the inner core. Look at the dominance of the inner core, it's mostly made out of iron and nickel. If you look this, it's a little more different in composition when you come to outer core. Certainly, liquid in the sense it's viscous in nature. That's one thing which I would like to state. And the second thing what you asked us was only for certain distances what we do. How did we know that you have this kind of a layer? Only after a certain distance. See, as earthquakes occur, we have seismological stations all over the globe. After a certain distance, the shear wave, the transverse wave which you saw, just disappears. You don't. It either gets refracted and converts and comes out, or it's why? Because these are elastic waves. And I said that mu. I mean, I will not be talking. To define the velocity of a shear wave is mu by rho. Mu is the rigidity and rho is the density. For a fluid, it tends more or less towards zero. That is the reason why we found that the absence of shear waves after a certain distance. That's one thing. The second thing, this Dr. Manglik who works, if you would like to, because he does a lot of modeling on why the outer core is liquid compared to the inner core, I'll ask him to define much.
Yes, what you say, general perception is that temperature increases with gap. And any material, when temperature increases, will go from solid phase to liquid phase. Thermodynamics of core material is slightly different. When we talk of core, we talk of is made of iron. But it is not only iron, we also talk of some light density elements. And these elements, likely candidates, are like sulfur, oxygen. Some also, if you have gone through some literature or some news items, we also talk of radiogenic potassium. So happens is thermodynamics wise, the pressure temperature condition is such that this material, when it reaches the outer core, core mental boundary, that is the boundary where that separates totally the compositionally silicate metal from the iron core. That time, thermodynamically, this part goes into liquidous phase. But as you go down deeper, this basically again crosses back to solid gas. That's where this inner core boundary, the inner core becomes solid, and this boundary is basically a thermodynamic boundary and not a computational or phase boundary. So that's how it happens. And how do we find this? Is directly we don't have any observation. As Dr. Srinagesh mentioned, that seismic waves, one kind of seismic waves, S waves, which don't propagate into the outer core, but they propagate inside the inner core. That's how we find that outer core is liquid. But there's a gamut of other things, like high pressure mineral physics experiments, which are done earlier were done by shock experiments. Now people use diamond anvil. And also there are first principle computations, very high-end molecular computations, which try to simulate these materials at those pressure and temperature. When I'm talking of pressure, we are talking something from 150 gigapascal to 350 gigapascal. And when you talk temperature, somewhere around 3000 degrees centigrade. But this is a potential temperature. If you're going into the center of the earth, something like 6000 centigrade plus large errors, these are uncertainties. But a lot of mineral physics, thermodynamics, these all come. And observational evidence is seismic stone plays its own role. And another important observation, which we all know, is the geomagnetic field. You must have come across several literatures, even newspapers nowadays, gold is moving, yield is decreasing, etc., etc. So this is the reason where this field is happening. So it's a lot of physics, a lot of experimental work which is involved. Into that.
Okay. So I have some questions which I have noted from some other platforms. People want to know how and why earthquakes are occurring in Hyderabad. So maybe you can throw some light on it.
Earthquakes which are occurring in Hyderabad, because I suppose the recent last week, which you had very, very minor micro tremors in Borabanda. See, first of all, what I told you is you have to have a fault, and these faults are the place or the junction where the stresses get accumulated. And once the stresses uh, exceeds the strength of the rock, the slip takes place and the earthquake starts. Mostly what we are finding in Hyderabad at Jubilee Hills, Borabanda, Vanasilipuram from 2010 till date. For Jubilee Hills it was started in 1996. These are all very, very shallow earthquakes. Whenever the monsoon has been quite high, excess, the water percolates into the rocks, and these rocks have pores and they are devoid of water, and once the water enters, the pore pressure increases, and then slowly they are already critically stressed, hence they release the strain energy. This is something called the hydroseismicity, which is being observed all over the place, all over the world. This is a phenomena where you have extreme events happening, or mostly the water is being pumped out and the water starts getting into these voids and cracks. The pore pressure increases and the earthquake. So for Hyderabad, mostly what we have seen are earthquakes less than 2.5 magnitude, and they are all associated with seasonal monsoon rains, excepting one which we had in 1983, which is the 4.8 Mitchell earthquake, which is tectonic in nature. Rest all, as on today, with whatever instrumentation and whatever data we have, these are all very, very small micro earthquakes.
Thank you, Dr. Nagesh. There is a question by Mr. Rahul. He wants to know what is the depth of investigation in case of heli-borne survey. So, you will like to answer? Or? Okay, yeah. Depth of investigation in case of heli-borne survey. I think he's referring to groundwater survey only.
So, depth of investigation depends on what is the conductivity distribution, what is the moment, in fact, which is nothing but NIA, number of turns of the coil, then current injected into the loop, then what is the area of the loop, and then what is the noise level. So all things together, combined together, it decides what is the depth of investigation. For example, if you have a hard rock where you have a shallow conductive, then deeper is highly resistive. Irrespective of whatever moment, whatever the power of system, your DOI will be limited to the shallow level, because deeper level is the conductivity is too high to be sensitive. However, in case of deeper level, a quite deep level, the conductive zones are there, and top is resistive. That becomes very advantageous, where the resistive become insensitive and the deeper zone become very sensitive. So, and the resistive become a transparent kind of zone, which is not at all creating any limitation. And in that case, you can get very deep DOI. In general, what we use it, the heli-borne here, that was having 2,50,000 NIA, and we could see around 300 meter in alluvial, and roughly 150 to 200 in the hard rock case. However, currently what we are using, that has the system has got 5 lakh NIA, and we go around 400 to 500. Even there are systems much bigger than that can go exceed even 600 also. There are systems can go even a kilometer. So depending upon the power of the system, the conductivity distribution, the noise level in the vicinity, etc., all together decide the device. Thank you.
Thank you, Subhash. There is a question by Karthik. So he wants to know by what date or by when we'll be able to predict earthquakes. So maybe Dr. Poonchand Rao, you want to answer?
I think that's a very difficult question because for more than 100 years now, there's been a lot of research being carried out in various countries in the world on earthquake prediction, and has not been very successful. But before I fully answer this, let us understand what we mean by earthquake prediction. Earthquake prediction is not to say that in a certain place there's going to be an earthquake, because that's what a lot of people try to do. When you say earthquake prediction, you need to specify the place, the time, and the size of the earthquake, which is in terms of magnitude. So only if you can pinpoint the location, time, and magnitude, that's when we are talking about prediction, which is at the moment not possible, as I can say. But what is possible? Let's try to quickly understand that the earthquakes which occur in different parts of the world, we understand why they occur. What is the mechanism that causes earthquakes? But because of the complex structure of the earth, it's very difficult to be able to pinpoint the time, location, and magnitude. But a lot of studies are going on which are called precursory studies. That means we are able to successfully identify certain observations prior to the occurrence of an earthquake. For example, we find a lot of increase in the intensity of smaller earthquakes, or which are called micro earthquakes. Or we find sudden changes in the water levels. For example, if you have wells in an area, you'll find that the water level, the surface suddenly goes up or down, which is associated with tectonic changes that might give rise to an earthquake. Similarly, you find the emission of certain gases through the fracture zones just before the occurrence of earthquakes. Similarly, we find several other parameters which show distinct changes before the occurrence of an earthquake. So these are called earthquake precursors, and people are very carefully studying these parameters and trying to find a model where we can say that if the following parameters show a certain level of rise, then there is going to be an earthquake in such and such time. So that attempt is still going on, and earthquake prediction is still a distant cry, is what I must say. So what is advised at the moment is to have precaution from earthquake to prevent getting hurt by an earthquake. And the best way for that is to build strong buildings for yourself and to construct your buildings as per the codes that have been prescribed by the Bureau of Indian Standards. The codes very clearly specify what kind of constructions should be done to be able to face the kind of earthquakes that are likely to happen. So at the moment, prediction is not possible in the strict sense, although some minor successes here and there you may have heard. I think we still have a long way to go in this direction.
Thank you. I think you already know Karthik, because his next question was, is there a need for earthquake-proof buildings in India? So you have already answered, like to follow building codes and build earthquake-resistant buildings. So that's, I mean, there's no need to overemphasize this. This is required. This is required in any city, in any scenario. You need to follow we have certain building codes which prescribe that in that region or in that zone, what kind of construction you can do, what are the precautions you need to take. So that's required. That's something which, for which you don't need to ask anybody. I mean, you just follow those codes. I have one or two more questions. So it seems that somebody is asking that there was a drone which was used in geophysical survey by NGRI. So if somebody can tell on this, Dr. Jamanglik, use of drone in geophysical survey used by NGRI.
Question is that NGRI is using drone or not? Actually, yes. NGRI has started this beginning. We have entered into development of a drone-based electromagnetic system. This is not only NGRI, but this is basically an effort of 4 different CSR labs who have come together in the program which NGRI is leading. Here we are having drone and first successful experiment of using drone for magnetic survey was done and was presented also in the morning in director's presentation. We are developing these things, these systems, also for electromagnetic surveys for near surface exploration, similar to what one of the presenter has presented on helipond surveys. On similar lines, NGRI is working on use of drone for geophysical surveys.
Thank you. There's another related question which is on diamond exploration. So maybe if you can highlight NGRI contribution and what NGRI is doing in case of diamond exploration. Yeah. Dr. Bulsu.
NGRI is involved right from the beginning for diamond exploration in parts of Andhra Pradesh and then also central India and other places. Of course, you all know that diamonds come from deeper parts of the earth, something like 150 kilometers to 200 kilometers. So they come through what is magmatic rocks called kimberlites. So these rocks that come from very deep portions of the earth, they brought up along with them the diamonds. And finding them is like finding a needle in a haystack. It's not at all easy task. So NGRI started this business some 30 years back and more than that actually. And then we are still involved with that. We use several different geological, geophysical, and geochemical techniques to pinpoint these kimberlites. And the hardness or the importance of this finding of kimberlites is doubled or complex in such a way that some of the kimberlites may not be diamond bearing. So it's a very difficult task and one of the most challenging tasks for geoscientists because the diamonds, that you all know, are very valuable things in precious stones, and they're also very useful for industrial purposes. We were involved in both geophysical, for example, some of the very early helipond surveys that NGRI carried out is for the discovery of these kimberlite pipes. And we also did several heavy mineral characterization in several parts of, as I said, Andhra Pradesh and also the central Indian parts. And right now, our group is involved in finding out and helping the National Mineral Development Corporation in their efforts to look at the central Indian kimberlite pipes. We have a project with them. And I'm very glad that at least NMDC is finding more and more kimberlite pipes there. So hopefully we get more diamonds. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciation. There's one question for Dr. Nandan. What are we doing in case in water conservation, water scarcity in Hyderabad or in surrounding region? Can you?
Yeah, I mean, if this question is in particular for Hyderabad city, especially for the groundwater conservation or surface water also, there is no much scope left at this moment because most of the water resources in the city are polluted. So this is not of as such big usage to go for water conservation, and city has a lot of 400 lakes. Already they are storing water in the rainy season and a good recharge is there in the city. But if just go away from the city, especially in Nalgonda and surrounding all districts, there is a lot of water scarcity. And depending upon the groundwater levels and depending upon the usage. So we have to adopt appropriate techniques, and in the hard rock areas we have to go for percolation tanks, we have to go for check dams, and we have to identify the right kind of locations in those areas and suggest the suitable structures, and then should go for recharge.
Thank you, Dr. Anand. Somebody wants to know NGRI contribution in case of oil exploration. So if you can add a few words here.
Coming to the question of oil exploration, most of the time NGRI is involved in mapping the resources, although not directly into the exploitation phases. Right now NGRI is dealing with two major topics. One is basalt imaging. It is understood that whenever there is a huge lava flow like what has happened with the Deccan volcanism, there are some sediments which are enriched with hydrocarbons which are lying underneath the trap sections, underneath the volcanic sediments. So that is one area of exploration where we are trying to find out the thickness of such kind of sediments. And then we submit the report to the actual exploitation agencies, the oil companies. And the second major thing what NGRI is involved in is the gas hydrate exploration. Wherein we are trying to map the possible occurrences of gas hydrates, their thickness, and the amount of gas hydrate, the saturation, and all other related aspects. And this study was carried out by NGRI indigenously for KG and Mahanadi offshore basins. And right now there is some lookout of looking into the already existing data from the Andaman offshore and maybe some other parts of deeper KG basin areas. So I think.
Thank you. There's one last question which I will direct to Dr. Subhash. I'll just read out the question. The question is, how can farmers be helped in finding groundwater accurately instead of drilling too many bore wells? That's a valid question, so I couldn't sort of place myself.
As mentioned during my talk, that groundwater is not a subject that can be dealt at point, and farmer can have a land of different size. In fact, the government of India, through the Central Groundwater Board, already started aquifer mapping, national level, but then the kind of resolution they have currently cannot be used directly by the farmer. But then now it is going to be increased. I mean, the resolution we are going to increase day by day, and the CSIR NGRI is involved, associated with the Central Groundwater Board, where the idea is to map the zone with the priority. And now what we have taken in the northwest India, where we may be coming as a kind of grid zone where the information can be made available. So such information can be directly utilized by the farmers. And these kind of drilling, what you do, you get inferred the lithology, and the same thing can be inferred, in fact, by the geophysical method. So wherever we have surveyed, it can be directly used it, and slowly with the time that can come, that can cover. And certainly there has to be certain kind of regulation by the state groundwater authorities, and they are supposed to provide and help these kind of investigations to be done. So right now I can't reply that how they can do it. It may not be possible. The art farmers, they can go and use it, but then with time, I think we are going to have these kind of map can be used directly.
Thank you, Doctor. I think we need to close it now. Although there are many more questions, but I think it's time to close it. But before we close, I would like to thank Dr. Shinagesh, Dr. Kirti Srivastava, and Dr. Subhash for their very good coverage of their respective topics, earthquake, tsunami, and groundwater. I also want to thank all our panelists, Dr. Kumchandra Rao, Dr. Ajay Manglik, Dr. Srinivas, Dr. Ramohan, Dr. Nandan, Dr. Devendra Kumar, and Dr. Satyamani. Thanks for answering all the queries raised by students and general audience. Finally, I would like to thank everybody who joined us online. And with this, I think we are going to end it here. Thank you very much.